very much, and may I say what a pleasure it is to be speaking again to the CPS and for the first time to Big Brother Watch, and it scarcely seems credible that it was almost 3 years ago now that we launched our study on entry powers, trying to catalogue all the different powers that existed in relation to dwellings, and to explain some of the problems that were associated with them and the reason why we thought the law needed reform. And I remember being absolutely delighted as well as flabbergasted by the degree of attention that we were able to get focused in the public sphere on the issue of entry powers. It certainly seemed to be a topic that caught the attention and the imagination both of the media and of the public, and I think that's attributable in part to the fact that it's one of those subjects that exquisitely blends the serious and the ridiculous in almost equal measure. And certainly the process of researching the paper and trying to catalogue all these powers was not without its lighter moments. One thinks in particular of the Public Health Act 1936, under which an inspector or local health official can forcibly enter a dwelling if necessary in order to effect the cleansing of verminous persons. That'll all be a lesson to us to take care of our personal hygiene, unless somebody else should take care of it for us. Or alternatively, perhaps the legislation dating from the 1950s, under which an inspector can enter any premises, including a private dwelling if needs be, just to ensure that nobody is being hypnotised on the premises. Or thirdly and finally, my personal favourite, legislation dating from 1998, under which an inspector can come into your home just to make sure that you have not detonated and are not about to detonate a nuclear weapon. If you were thinking of doing so, be warned, you could face a fine. For all that though, the issue of entry powers is no joke, and I think there are really three reasons why we said in Crossing the Threshold that it's an important issue that we should pay attention to, and until it's sorted out, that we should be worried about. And the first of those is the level and extent of use of these powers. Some of them may seem obscure, some of them may seem bizarre, but even those that you would expect were a minor irritation to the country as a whole are used on a surprisingly frequent and regular basis. Just to take one example, the power under the Bees Act, which involves inspectors coming on to look at bees on your land. I'm not suggesting that's not an important power, I'm certain to be contradicted if I did, but nonetheless one which you might expect wasn't terribly prominent, used well over 1,000 times a year. So this is not the kind of topic that ought to be of interest only to legal nerds. It is a very real part of our national life, and something which we can all expect to encounter on average probably at least once or twice in our homes during the time when we live there. The second reason why I think they're important is because of the bizarre range and variety of these powers. At the time when I wrote my pamphlet, there were 266 that affected domestic premises, i.e. private dwellings, and each of those was individual. There is no and has never been a underlying statement of principles or any single code that governs how these powers are exercised. They are all unique, they all contain unique provisions as to how, when, by whom, how often, and on what grounds they can be used. And so as a citizen, if one imagines facing somebody on the doorstep, no doubt with a laminated badge, one really has no idea whether he should be there, how he or she can enter, whether they should have given you notice, whether they should have got a warrant, how much notice, are you allowed to stall them and check their accreditation? If you do, are you committing a criminal offence? What would the penalties be for that criminal offence? Realistically, with 266 individual discrete powers, without any common footing, there is no way that you as a citizen can be in a state where you know exactly what your rights are. Well, I should say no way, unless of course you equip yourself with a handy copy of Crossing the Threshold by a good bookshop. And thirdly and finally, there's another reason why we should be worried about the current state of powers of entry. Some of them are absurdly imbalanced and lopsided in favour of people exercising them and against the rights of those who are subject to them. One thinks in particular of secondary legislation allowing entry for the purposes of checking whether or not cows are infected with BSE. And that's one that can be used on private property, and indeed we put one example of our book when it was used, not on a farm, but essentially in somebody's garden where they kept a pet cow. And it really shone a light on what can go wrong when there is no underlying rationale, no overarching principles of how these powers are drafted. That legislation does not specify when entry can take place. It could be any time of the day or night. It allows a team of unlimited size to go onto the land. And in fact, the inspectors in this particular example went completely overboard with a team of more than 20 people. If you obstruct those inspectors, you can go to prison. On the other hand, for whatever they do while they're on your land, they enjoy a blanket legal immunity for civil liability for anything they might do, not only in the exercise of their powers, but even in the purported exercise of their powers. So if they go beyond what they're allowed to do, but they claim they're allowed to do it, they can't be sued. Another example would be the writ of assistance, an oddly general and personal commission held by customs officers, who thereby have the right to go into any house where they believe there may be substances or items liable to seizure by customs, for example, if duty hasn't been paid on them. And that commission, which they can hold, lasts for the entirety of the reign of the monarch who issued it to them. In fact, the abuse of that extraordinary wide power was one of the reasons for the revolt of the American colonies more than 230 years ago. They saw fit to ban the exercise of that power in that constitution. But so long after they relieved us of the burden of supervising them, we are still using it. And HMRC told us when we queried it that they used that power more than 100 times a year. They couldn't actually tell us why, or why they couldn't wait and get a warrant under those circumstances from a JP like anyone else. So those are the reasons why we said one ought to be concerned about the current state of entry powers. And what we proposed was a bill, a new piece of legislation, to put them all on a single footing and give that one overarching code of conduct which people could rely on if they were ever in a position of having someone want to come into their house. And initially it seemed as if we had a powerful ally on our side. In a speech to Westminster University in September of 2007, Prime Minister Gordon Brown invited the country to join him in, and I quote, writing a new chapter in this country's story of liberty. He singled out powers of entry into private premises as one of the key features that ought to have attention paid to it as part of the writing of this new chapter. And some of his words and some of the points that he made were eerily and nay hauntingly reminiscent of crossing the threshold, and some of the points we made in there, although I'm sure that's a coincidence. The Prime Minister said that he was appointing a commission of some of his subordinates, for some reason acting in concert with the Association of Chief Police Officers, to look into this and decide what could be done about it. Well, nothing happened, save that several further powers of entry made their way onto the statute book during that period. And in time it seemed that the issue had disappeared from public view, and we could not expect that anything was going to result. But just in that dark hour, a hero arose. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's a hereditary peer. And I'm delighted to see that Lord Selston is with us. His powers of entry, etc. bill, which I'm privileged to hold in my hand, lists an enormous number of powers, not only those exercisable over dwellings, but over business premises, both primary and secondary legislation. It contains exactly what we proposed, a single code of conduct, so that everyone could have the certainty that they knew what an inspector is and isn't allowed to do. It is currently going through the House of Lords. One does not know, of course, whether Mr. Brown would be in a position when it comes to the Commons to give it life, but it may well be that that is in his gift, and one hopes that he does. If he does not, if he kicks the issue into the long grass, then doubtless history will remember that unkindly, albeit in a paragraph, in a footnote on page 214. If he does, on the other hand, if he takes hold of this issue firmly, whether by the lapels or not, then he has an opportunity to give himself that record in history of having helped to make a small but nonetheless decisively positive contribution to the law in this area, and let us all hope he does so. Thank you.